thanks for coming. There's coffee right here.
When are you going to be in Nyen?
My name is Jane Debevoise, and I normally don't use something in this room because it's my voice is loud enough and everybody knows. I am the chair of Age Art Archive in New York, in America. We also the chair emeritus, the long-term chair of Age Art Archive in Hong Kong. And just so that all of you know, we also have an office in Delhi, India. This is a very special occasion for us. We are a library archive and platform for discussions, but really important to us is collaborations and building community. And I've been working with the Foundation for Spirituality and the Arts with Tyler and Lisa. Is a great opportunity to collaborate, but also a great honor because I've known both of you for a very long time, and we really feel like kindred spirits in many ways. So we are a library and archive, we, Age Art Archive, but I'm going to, and a platform for these kinds of collaborative and discussions, and we want everybody, not everybody, there's too many people, but many people to participate today. And don't worry about the silly question or the misunderstanding. We're here to jointly interrogate, question, reflect, and feel Ho Chi Nyen's work. And so again, we're really, really pleased to have Ho Chi Nyen, another long-term collaborator with Age Art Archive, and now the Foundation for Spirituality in the Arts. So I'm going to hand it over to Tyler. And Tyler, thank you very much for this opportunity.
I just wanted to thank Jane and Claire and the whole team here at Asia Art Archives for really not just hosting, but really for making this whole event possible for us and to have this wonderful sense of hospitality. Asia Art Archive, as I'm sure you all know, has just been an amazing force in Asian art throughout the world, particularly here in New York and in Hong Kong. Also, I want to thank our sponsors, the Jim Thompson Foundation and the Nyen Museum, for supporting this initiative. We will actually be doing a follow-up program in Bangkok on January 21st with Sue, that's going to be at the Jim Thompson Arts Center there. And I also wanted to thank, of course, my team at FSA, particularly Lisa Amadi and Julie and Keller, for coordinating all this partially remotely. So our format, just to remind you, so I have, I think, 3 more minutes, and then Sue is going to speak for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have a brief panel discussion just to flesh out a few of the ideas, and then be open to questions after that. So if anyone needs to sneak out, maybe it'll be good to do so between those different parts of the program. And just, of course, please make sure to silence your phones and other devices. So I'm not going to go on about FSA, but I will just say that Foundation for Spirituality and the Arts was started really just to foster these sorts of conversations, to really highlight the interconnectivity between the contemporary art world and this whole arena of spirituality, faith, a sense of something beyond the self. This often involves artists who have this sense of a kind of humility that allows them to feel they are accessing something beyond the ego, beyond the bounds of our material selves, into really being able to communicate that as well with this spirit of openness and connectivity. So that's the spirit I hope that we will engage with Sue today. So I'm particularly thrilled to welcome Ho Chi Nyen today. He's come all the way from Singapore, which is about as far as you can come, I think. So the program is called The World is a Space for Transformation, which I love that title. So Sue is briefly, I'll just say, is born in Singapore, is considered to be one of the leading artists from Asia relating to video in particular, and his video installations have been seen around the world, most recently at the Bard College Hessel Museum, which is a fantastic sort of mini retrospective that I hope many of you have been able to see. So his art practice delves deeply into philosophies, traditions, and histories with spiritual themes that offer fresh insights and perspectives about Southeast Asia, past and present. This program seeks to illuminate these connections, particularly fleshing out some themes that could be seen in his recent exhibition at Bard. I won't go into the full bio, but he's been seen in the U.S. at the Hammer Museum, also the Moore Museum, Guggenheim Bilbao, Singapore Art Museum, and many other solo shows around the world. He did represent Singapore for the Venice Biennale. I think that was 2011. And we had a wonderful program Monday at MoMA, focusing particularly on his major work, Hotel Euphoria, in which a lot of the discussion was about very deep philosophical themes and the aesthetics of film and film history. So I think that will be quite an interesting counterpoint to today's focus, which is on spiritual themes in his work. So I'd like to welcome Sue to the stage. Thank you.
Hello everyone, good afternoon. I'm going to start with the title of the exhibition. No, not exhibition. The world is a space for transformation. I think when I first discussed the title with Lisa a few months ago, apparently this was something that I mentioned in an interview, but now I can't really remember when I said this. So it feels like someone else said this, you know. So I like to begin a little bit with the title, really just kind of like working around the title. And but how do we change or transform the title? I think maybe we can start on that track. So the key word for me in the title is transformation. So I would like to kind of like stick with that. I think to transform doesn't necessarily mean to abandon the old, but retaining something of it and changing it to fit the present. So I would like to propose a possible title is T for transformation. So it doesn't really say very much about transformation, except that that's kind of like the key word. But I've had a practice. One of my previous projects is called the Critical Dictionary of Southeast Asia. So I worked a lot with like keywords, and kind of the starting letter of the words are usually important for me because of the dictionary structure. So I like to propose T for transformation as one of the possible titles. But I also find that once you have one term, like T for transformation, it almost asks for company. It wants a second. Once you have one, there's a desire for the two. So with T for transformation, I would like to propose another title, another possible title as well, which is T for tigers. So I've made quite a number of works related to the history and cosmologies of tigers over the last years. So I think this also kind of like fits in. But the problem is that once you have two, it asks for a third. It wants company. So this is going to be the final title that I'm proposing for today, which is T for tiger, T for time, and T for transformation. So T for time is the title of the last kind of like major work I produced. It premiered late last year. So I will speak a little bit about the project later. So our title is made up of three parts: T for tiger, T for time, and T for transformation. So our presentation today will also follow this three-part structure. So I will begin with part one of three, which is T for tigers. So let me speak a little bit about this. What you are looking at here is actually a screen capture of a website that was constructed like in 2017 as part of a project called the Critical Dictionary of Southeast Asia, which was actually commissioned by the Asia Art Archive from like 2012. I was the longest resident in the Asia Art Archives history because it took me 5 years to complete the project. Yeah. So anyway, I'm not going to speak a lot about the dictionary, but anyone can visit the dictionary if you go to the website address here. So let me try to summarize what the dictionary is about. I would say it's a definition of Southeast Asia through moving images and some words that is algorithmically edited. So it's changing all the time. And it changes all the time because the story of Southeast Asia is itself always changing. So we have an installation version of this work, but it's also available online. So in the dictionary, there are 26 letters, so 26 terms. I'm just going to focus on one of them, which is T, T for tigers. So let me begin with tigers. Southeast Asia, as some of you might know, it's a region of extreme heterogeneity. It's if you imagine like Vietnam at the top of northern part of Southeast Asia and Indonesia in the southern end. Very little commonalities seem to occur across these geographies. So it's like the basic question is what makes Southeast Asia a region? And one of the propositions is to think about tigers. So tigers first dispersed across Southeast Asia when it was still a single land mass known as the Sunda Shelf. So this was more than 1 million years ago. So after that, sea levels rose and broke Sunda apart into the current shape of Southeast Asia. So in a way, if we think about the trajectories of tigers, it's a way to kind of like link this heterogeneous area together. So in many parts of Southeast Asia, there are myths related to tigers. So in the Malay part of Southeast Asia, which is Malaysia, Indonesia, you have this, this is an old pre-Islamic animist concept of the tiger as some kind of ancestral figure. So in the Malay part of Southeast Asia, it's usually people avoid calling the tiger by its name because one believes that that would kind of like summon the tiger's presence. So you usually refer to the tiger with other terms like datuk, which means something like grandfather. So it's always a term of kinship to tigers. So in Southeast Asia, tigers has something to do with like ancestral presence. There is almost a belief that tigers are kind of mediums for ancestral spirits to travel within. So we can think of tigers as a kind of container and the spirit as that which is contained. So along with these myths comes also the myth of were-tigers. So I suppose in Europe one has the werewolf. In South America, I think you have the were-jaguar. So in Southeast Asia, we have were-tigers. So it is said that shamans have the ability to transform into tigers. And these transformations, interestingly, always takes place in the presence of water. So one transforms into a were-tiger by moving underneath a stream. So you need moving water in order to transform. And tigers, I would say, are also actually creatures of the liminal zone. So sometimes we imagine that tigers live in the forest, but actually tigers, they live at the boundary between the forest and the waters. So shamans, as I mentioned, have the ability to transform into tigers. So there are certain martial arts forms in the Malay world like silat, where the movements are also based on the movement of tigers. And it is said that like masters of silat also have the ability to transform into tigers. So what I'm getting at, in a sense, is that tigers in Southeast Asia are creatures of transformation. They can transform like between the animal world and the human world, but also the spirit world and the present world, between the ancestors and the present. This is just a short quotation from Ma Huan. Ma Huan was the interpreter of the great Ming Dynasty navigator Chen Ho, who sailed from Ming Dynasty China around the world. And he ended up in Malacca, which is in current-day Malaysia. And he says, in the town, there are tigers which can assume human form. They enter the markets and walk about, mixing with the populace. If anyone recognized one of these creatures, he would seize it and kill it. And this is an image found from an early book, an anthropological text written by two British colonial officers slash scholars. And it's apparently a photograph of a were-tiger. But the book doesn't explain how and why they are were-tigers. This image simply appears in the book. And kind of like the last image I want to share in giving you a bit of context of tigers is this one. So this is a wood engraving by a German artist, Heinrich Reutemann. It's dated around 1865. And the title of the print is Interrupted Road Survey in Singapore. And this is a real, actual historical event. This road survey took place in 1835 in the forests of Singapore. So we see the road surveyor was the gentleman dressed in white. His name is George Drongo Coleman. He was Singapore's first chief architect, urban planner, and chief surveyor. So he led a mission to survey the forest because the British wanted to create more gambia and pepper plantations. And this survey mission was disrupted by the emergence of the Malayan tiger, as you can see from the print. Interestingly, no humans were harmed in this encounter. But what the tiger did was that it destroyed the instrument, which is known as the theodolite, which is the most expensive instrument in this kind of survey missions. Right? So the tiger kind of knew what it was doing. Kind of like went straight for the machine. And actually, shortly after this encounter, I would say this was also the beginning of the end for tigers in Singapore. So because of the need to create plantations in the forest, what that actually enabled was a kind of increase in the intensity of human-tiger encounters. So workers had to be sent into the forest to clear more of the forest. So that increased their chances of like meeting with tigers. And by creating these empty zones around the forest, you are actually creating the favored habitat of tigers. So I think the situation became so bad that so many workers were attacked by tigers that people didn't want to work in that job anymore. So the solution was that a bounty system was created by the companies. So every tiger killed could be exchanged for cash. And that was basically it for the tigers. So by the early 20th century, tigers became extinct in Singapore. But looking at this image is also interesting to think about its composition. So on one side we have the road surveyor, and in a sense he's a representative of European Enlightenment. And the survey mission, we can imagine that to be a project to transform a landscape into a series of numbers, right, so that it can be mapped precisely. And on the other side, we have an indigenous creature, chaotic, difficult to control, unpredictable. So in a sense, we have a kind of classic binary clash within this image. So next, this is an image from one of my last works about tigers, called One or Several Tigers, which was on show at the Hassel Museum. So this is a double channel video installation. And these two screens are facing each other. And on one screen is basically populated by the tiger, and the other screen is populated by the road surveyor. And the tiger and the road surveyor are singing a duet about this 1 million year long history of humans and tigers. So that's kind of like essentially the structure of the work. But I like to think further about the perspectives and the point of views in this work. So for me, it was always interesting that when an audience steps into the space between the two screens, the audience needs to decide which screen to look at. So if one looks at the tiger, you can also imagine that that becomes an embodiment of the point of view of the surveyor and vice versa. Right? So this kind of like shifting of perspectives was something that was kind of critical for me in planning this project. So the tiger and Coleman, throughout the work, they also begin to slowly rotate positions. So you are always embodying one of these figures, looking at the other, but your position is also always something constantly shifting. And I think this multiplicity of perspectives is something I will speak a little bit more about. So this is us just kind of like focusing on one screen, on George Strongbow Coleman. So the two figures are suspended in black empty space. And I want to speak a little bit about the process of how this image is made. This is actually what we call 3D animation, so three-dimensional animation. So the figures they are completely digital, but we can also imagine them to be puppets. They are hollow like a container, so there's no movement. So in order to make them move, to animate them, we use a process known as motion capture or mocap in short. So basically we suspended an actor, and the actor in this case is the singer who produced the vocals. So we suspended him from the ceiling, and he was singing and performing and moving, and we recorded all of these motions as data, and we inserted it into these hollow puppets. The puppets of both the surveyor but also the tiger. So they were both actually sung by the same actor and performed and acted by the same actor. So it's kind of interesting for me that one person is now split into two because we have essentially the same agents producing the voices and the movements. But what is also interesting for me was that it struck me that this structure is exactly parallel to the animistic structure of how tigers were understood in the ancient Malay world, which is essentially as a medium, like the empty container, which can carry souls, right, like within them. But now instead of souls, we have motion captured data. So this brings me also to the word animism. And if we think about animism and the process involved in this, we also think about the word animation. So they share the same Greek roots. So animals, animism, animation. We can also think of anima or animus, which is like the soul. So these are just some more images from the work. The other kind of like key property that struck me when I was working with animation, so I should also explain why these figures are suspended in this black empty space. Because for me, what was the key characteristic of animation was that it was weightless. So in animation, one doesn't observe gravity, so figures can be suspended and floating. This is what is primarily different from image that are captured with a camera. And the other main property of animation, I would say, is the propensity for transformation. So animated figures can shift their shapes, they can elongate, they can stretch. We see this from the history of animation from the very beginning. Actually, human-animal hybrids were always at the heart of animation history, right? Like Donald Duck or Mickey Mouse, which will be quite scary creatures to if you experience them in real life. So the tiger is constantly kind of like shifting its shape. and of course becoming this like hollowed out rock at some point, or becoming this bulbous sort of mass. And close to the end, there's also a moment in which surveyor and tiger reunites in the same frame. And this image is slowly kind of like recomposed back into this encounter. So in the work, one of these screens is actually movable, and behind the screens, what you see is a set of shadow puppets. I won't go further into this work, but I would like to focus instead on the story of tigers. I mentioned that tigers became extinct by the beginning of the 20th century, but my story about the tigers doesn't stop with their physical extinction. In a way, for me, the story of tigers continue even after their death. So, yeah, I just wanted to speak about this moment as one of the modes of return of the tiger. So actually this is, 7th December 1941 was the attack on Pearl Harbor. So this was, I think a few days ago was just kind of like the anniversary of that, right? So usually we think of the attack on Pearl Harbor as the beginning of the theater of war in the Pacific. But actually kind of like at around the same time, the invasion of Malaya by the Japanese forces happened. So Singapore and Malaysia were very quickly overrun by Japanese forces in what Winston Churchill called the greatest military defeat ever suffered by the United Kingdom, was their defeat at the hands of the Japanese. So there are many reasons given for the speed of the British defeat. One of the main reasons was that the Japanese troops were able to move very swiftly in the forest, and they were amphibious. They were said to be extremely cunning and savage. And all of these are the same qualities that one would project on a tiger. And the leader of the Japanese 25th Army is General Tomoyoki Yamashita, who was widely known as the Tiger of Malaya. So this is how my story of tigers continues. It continues as a metaphor. So shortly after the end of the Second World War, Malaya entered into a state of emergency. So basically it was a civil war with the guerrillas from the Communist Party. And tigers as a metaphor returned again in that period, usually to describe members of the Communist Party. So it's interesting to think about communism at that moment. It was, of course, kind of a state of paranoia. Communism induces paranoia because one doesn't know who is a communist. Right? Communism is something that hides inside. So that makes me think of that earlier quote from Marwan about rare tigers in the marketplace. So these evoke paranoia because one can't tell who is a rare tiger or a communist. But anyway, tigers return were very often used as metaphors in describing the guerrilla forces. And I also want to think a little bit about the word metaphor, like the etymology of the word. It's derived from the Greek metapherein. Basically, a metaphor means to transfer or to carry over. So a metaphor, in a way, is a kind of vehicle to carry something over. And I just want us to think back a little bit about the tiger itself as a vehicle in relation to this usage of the word metaphor. So this is kind of near to the end of one or several tigers when the screen retracts and we see this set of shadow puppets behind. And on the opposite screen, we see a group of people looking at this stage. And this is something kind of like interesting for me in the sense that I start imagining that at this moment, this work is entirely self-contained. It doesn't require a human audience because the audience is already built into the work itself. So I start to think a little bit about rituals and what rituals mean. So for me, a ritual is something in which humans participate and there are no spectators. So that would be kind of like the difference between a ritual and a performance. So for a long time, I imagined one or several tigers as a kind of ritual played out between the tiger and the surveyor, kind of continuing forever. And us, the humans, spectators, we just happen to be there, taking either the perspective of the tiger or the surveyor. And maybe on this note, I want to share like a short anecdote, like kind of like from my childhood, because recently I was doing an interview about my practice, and for some reason, I started thinking about this sort of incident in my early childhood. So I thought I would share that with everyone here today as well. So I remember that when I was in kindergarten, my best friend's father was a medium. He was a medium who channeled a Chinese deity called哪or the Third Prince. Yeah. And it just so happened that my nanny, who was taking care of me at that time, belonged to that circle of believers. So actually, so many days after school, I would end up at my friend's apartment and I would be witnessing this instance of spirit possession and transformation. Yeah. I have just very vague memories of it, but I remember it was always hazy with smoke from the incense. And one of my strongest visual images was basically kind of like towards the end of the ritual. The medium basically, he would put a knife through his cheek and then he would extract that. So my deepest impression was this line, like the red line left by the knife, and also his eyes, which were like kind of bulging red. And I often wondered like who is looking through those eyes at this moment. So I don't have, unfortunately, I have no photographs of this. So, but this is something I found on the internet as a case of like mediumship in Singapore within somebody's like living quarters. Yeah. So this comes very close, I would say, like to the mood of what I experienced at the time. We have 15 minutes left and I'm still at the first part. So that's a nice segue into theme of time. So this is part 2 of 3, theme for time. So like I mentioned earlier, my last project was about time and I spent about 2.5 years working on it. And I was reading many books on time and it struck me that many of these books always repeat the same quotation from St. Augustine. So apparently St. Augustine said something like this, I'm paraphrasing. He says, everybody thinks they know what is time until they are asked to explain it. So I find that very true. So I'm in a similar situation now, but let's try to work through this. So I want us to think about time through the two parts of my work, which is called T for Time. The first part of it is called Timepieces, and the second one is called T for Time. So this is like an installation view of the timepieces. It's basically made up of 43 screens. Each of them have a different size and shape. Each one of them also has a very different playback system. I will explain that later. But they are all embodying a different mode of time. And because for me, like after 2.5 years of like thinking about time, I kind of reached the conclusion, which maybe is not a very spectacular conclusion for many, but it's that time is multiplicity. That was like the thing that I tried to like work with, like how do you compose a multiplicity, right? Like, and what kind of multiplicity is it? Does it exist in a relationship of hierarchy? Is it horizontal? So these were my questions. And I guess because of the different natures of time and the different scales of time, it was logical that the screens were also heterogeneous. I also imagine timepieces to be a kind of a contents page for a novel about time. So these 43 screens actually represent like 42 different ideas about time. And all of these ideas, or the novel itself, the story is being told in the next part of the work, which is called T for Time. So this is an installation view of the work. So let me explain briefly the structure of T for Time. So if we imagine T for Time as a novel, it's a novel with 42 chapters, but the sequence of these chapters are entirely determined by an algorithm. So the algorithm decides which chapter follows which other chapter. And each chapter has 3 to 5 different versions and variations. So the algorithms is also kind of like making these decisions. And in terms of the image, the algorithm also decides what is on the screen in front and what is on the screen behind. So what you see here on the back screen is basically the source, the original image that I was working with. And in the front, we have what we call like 2D or two-dimensional animation made that is based on the original footage. So the audience is always seeing these two layers on top of each other. So now I'd like to go back to the timepieces, and I would like to focus on one specific timepiece. I will speak a little bit about some of these timepieces, but there are 42 of them, so there's no way we can finish them. So I'm going to be like super selective. So the first one that I want to look at is this video, which is just 1 second long. And it's a 1 second long video which is on an eternal loop, and it's of a pendulum. I would say this kind of like 1 second loop on the regular interval is in fact the essence of a clock. A clock works only if you can have a predetermined fixed like interval of timing. So the pendulum, which is also known as a simple harmonic oscillator, is at the core of the development of the modern Western clock. The history of clockmaking can be described as the search for ever more reliable forms of oscillation, from the movement of the pendulum, vibrations in quartz, to what we use now, which is atomic resonances, right, in our atomic clocks. So this is another timepiece that I want to look at. So this is a slightly longer video. This is 25 seconds long. This is actually one small part of a Chinese water clock, said to be built in the 11th century by Su Song. So what we are looking at here is actually a reconstruction in Nagano, in Japan, in the former Seiko Museum. So this is kind of like 4 stories high. It's a gigantic complex. Yeah. So the original name of this water clock is the Cosmic Engine, which is like a beautiful name. But it is said that the main function of this clock was not to tell time, but rather the emperor who commissioned it wanted to know the movement of the stars. So something as mundane as time was not interesting for the emperor. I guess the emperor only needed to know the cosmic rhythms. But what I find also interesting thinking about this clock is that it's a water clock, so it runs with a natural element. And I kind of compare and contrast that to a pendulum. A pendulum seems to move on its own. It doesn't seem to require an external input, but rather the pendulum is kind of like self-contained, it's self-propelling. So I would say in this, maybe it's also the divergence of like Western and Chinese science. And this is another timepiece. This is a timepiece called solar system rotation. So it basically tracks how long each planet in our solar system, how long it takes for them to rotate a single day. So actually this particular timepiece is an app, not a video, because the longest we see here is Mercury. So like one day in Mercury is 4,222 hours. So a day is something kind of like relative in our solar system, I suppose. This is another timepiece. This is called H4. So throughout the 18th century, various European powers with colonial and imperial designs offered reward for the accurate measurement of the longitude. So you needed longitude in order to be able to navigate safely. So there was a kind of competition amongst the colonial powers who could like fix the longitude. And this was eventually solved by this clock, which was created by an English carpenter called John Harrison. So he spent his whole life, almost 52 years, to solving this problem. And he finally solved it and claimed a huge reward, but he died like 4 years after that. And this is another timepiece which some of you might find familiar. So this is called Untitled Perfect Lovers. So this is based on Felix Gonzalez Torres' amazing work. And I think he mentioned something like these clocks, when installed, are initially set to the same time, but they eventually fall out of sync over the course of an exhibition, just as a lover can depart, which is kind of a beautiful way of describing it. So in my version of the work, the two clocks are perfectly in sync all the time because it is one image. But I'm not sure if this is an improvement over the original, I must say. So maybe the ability to fall out of sync, it's what is beautiful. Yeah. But that image made me think of this. For a long time, North Korea has had a problem with the time zone or synchronizing their time zone to South Korea. So when I was reading this article, I immediately thought of Felix Gonzalez Torres' clock. Yeah. It's good.
Yeah.
And this is another timepiece which is called Light Clock. This is a kind of a mental thought experiment by Einstein. So basically he says, kind of like the most perfect clock in our universe, theoretical clock, is a clock with a light beam that bounces like up and down. Yeah. So this is like a visualization of the clock experiment. So the other step of the experiment is if you have a clock which is stationary and another clock which is moving, does time pass equally on both clocks? So that I suppose the answer is no, and that's the mystery of the relativism in relation to light. So I have 5 minutes left, and I'm going to try my best. Yeah, maybe I will start to skip some of these time pieces and try to a little bit to learn. I wanted to share this as well. This is a mayfly, this timepiece. So after 350 million years of evolution, mayflies have perfected the art of life. They start as an egg, turn into a naiad, emerge from the water, fully matured as adults to reproduce, and start a family of 400, all within 2 days, and they die. So they don't even have like organs for feeding because it's not necessary. You just need to reproduce. And this is another timepiece called Apple Cube. This one is going to be a bit tough. This will take me like 15 minutes just to explain.
We're gonna borrow some time
Okay.
from the discussion session.
Okay, thank you.
Just a little bit.
Yes, I will try. Yeah. Okay. Let me try to dive like straight into this. This is like kind of one of the most interesting and complex of the timepieces for me. So in 1984, there was a Japanese novel called The Transformation of Meaning. written by Atsushi Mori, who studied topology when he was at university before he became a novelist. And there was a scene in the novel where he describes the protagonist peeling an apple, and he starts to describe the peeling of an apple in topological terms. It was quite a mind-blowing kind of like passage. I will read a little bit of this. He says, given that the blade which progressively slides from the bottom to the top is one-dimensional space called time, the apple's stalk becomes point at infinity, to which the one-dimensional space called time returns again, forming a circle. So this image that I obtained of a hand holding the apple, peeling the skin off the apple, is actually obtained from a filmmaker, Yasujiro Ozu. He has an amazing film which is called Late Spring. So all of Ozu's titles actually they refer to a very specific moment in a season. So you feel this like transience and passing of time, right? So the main character in this film is a retired professor called Professor Shukichi. So the whole story of this film is that he's basically trying to marry off his 27-year-old daughter. He's a widower. And the daughter doesn't want to be married because she likes staying with her dad. So at the end of the film, he finally succeeds in marrying off his daughter. And this is kind of like the ending scene. It's all blurred because that's what T for Time does to this footage. It sometimes blurs the original footage. But Professor Shukichi comes back home alone. So the house is alone because the daughter is married. Right? So he takes out his jacket and he begins sitting down and he begins peeling an apple. And that's how the film ends. Simply with this peeling of apple and time passing. Yeah. So this is actually footage shot by a good friend of mine called Tomoyoki Arai, who was a collaborator on my project as a co-script writer. He was trying to make a film in 2003, actually here in Brooklyn. This is where he shot the scene. He was trying to make a movie adaptation of Atsushi Mori's novel, The Transformation of Meaning, but he never finished the film because he had a problem with how he filmed the peeling of the skin of the apple. So for my project, I borrowed the footage from him and remade it into animation. So this apple skin peeling into a spiral kind of leads me to this next timepiece, which is called Tiger Tail. So some of you will be familiar with this as a Ouroboros, is that with the snake kind of like biting its own tail. But for me, I kind of replaced the snake with a tiger. Because tigers seem to keep coming back in my projects. So even when I stopped working on tigers, they started reappearing in my other projects and I couldn't like stop the tigers, like return. So I'm often asked by friends or colleagues, like, why did I select the tiger? Why did I work with the tiger? And I could never quite answer it until I finally thought, maybe I was not the one that selected the tiger, but the tiger selected me as a kind of medium, like a non-mystical, non-magical, mediocre medium, but the tiger selects me. You know, and the tiger, I must say, is a terrible master to work under. Yeah. So these are some scenes from Tea for Time. Again, this is based on Yasujiro Ozu's Late Spring. This was the father with the daughter on their last holiday before the daughter is married. And there was one moment when the father was like packing his books, and I always found this scene like super curious about what book he is holding. And actually, he was holding a book by nature, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. So we don't often think about Ozu and nature like in the same day. Yeah, so the eternal return, I think, lies underneath all of his family drama. Yeah, I'm going to skip now to many time pieces that it's not possible for me to like kind of like really get into. But just very quickly, these are actually family photographs of Tomoyuki Arai, the same guy who lent me the footage, right? And his dad had digitized all his family photos, every single one, and threw away all the negatives. And he burned it into a Blu-ray disc for Tomo. Imagining that the Blu-ray is the most advanced media of our time. But Tomo doesn't even have a disc player. So when I got the budget to create the project, I digitized all of the family archives and inserted it into the work as well. And I found it very moving, always like, even though Tomo is Japanese and 1 year older than I am, when I'm looking at the photographs, they feel like my own family photographs. And I think we were born kind of in the same time, in a moment of, I would say, late Asian modernity with the economic boom. So very similar family aspirations, like family homes, family holidays, family cars. Yeah. And just like the last character that I want to like kind of like introduce to all of you. This is an old gentleman by the name of Mr. P.K. Chan. I was a moving studio at the time when I was doing T for Time. And this old gentleman who's like 81 years old now, he's the caretaker of the building. And we got along very well, and he started sharing with me that he's actually a caretaker of public clocks in Singapore. So I followed him up to there's a Victoria Theatre in Singapore with a clock tower. It's the most prominent of these old public clocks. So I followed him on his rounds to maintain the clock. And Mr. Chan is very proud that this specific clock is the only clock in Singapore which hasn't been digitized. So it needs to be mechanically wound. So he says that this is like the only authentic clock in Singapore. But when I was with him, and I was observing how he adjusted the clock, he basically took out his mobile phone to check it. So that was a strange, like, kind of paradoxical moment. But still, after checking the mobile phone, he has to crank it manually. So there is a kind of like process of a delay in it, which, yeah. But anyway, Mr. Chan told me that for 30 years, he didn't go for a holiday longer than 3 days because he keeps needing to come back to wind the clock. So there's something incredible in his story. Like in 30 years of this care, he refers to the clock as his baby. And I think in care, there's a kind of like timelessness. Yeah. But at the same time, he's also in some sense a prisoner of time. So for me, these are the stories that I wanted to kind of like collect in T for Time. And and like I mentioned earlier, like how do all these different stories of different natures and types of time and time of different scales, how do they sit together? So that was kind of the biggest problem for me in finishing the work. And I decided that one of the first things to go is the timeline. So let me explain a little bit of the timeline. So for anyone working with like editing software, we are familiar with the timeline, right? So basically in filmmaking, we have the idea that there's always one perfect shot from which you can choose, one perfect sequence that you can lay out to make the perfect film. But I started to feel that this reduction to one was a kind of violence to the multiplicity I was interested in. So I'm interested, like in a way, like how do we create a moving image work without a timeline? So I abandoned this mode of thinking about films. And this is just a screen capture from an interface that we built. The system is called the Pandora. So basically this allows you to create associations between links. And this would fit into an algorithmic system that recomposes new versions of the work perpetually. So there is no longer one timeline, but multiple. And now I really need to end very quickly. And I would just say that we reached at least the third part of the presentation, which is T for transformation. And maybe I will just wrap this part up by just kind of like also describing a recent moment in my life. So after making T for time, which was part of a survey show that took us like 3 years to plan, and this was also past the COVID period, so it was a kind of like intense period. So after the work, the exhibition opened, I found myself completely exhausted and emptied out, which I suppose is normal, but I kind of felt a little bit like this. And but I was still on the way every day, like going back to my studio, even in this like state of emptiness. And it's my habit usually to read on the train. And just by chance, I started reading poems by Rainer Maria Rilke. I tried reading him in the last 20 years for like 3 times, and I just could like never get into it. But in my state of emptiness, this time I found that I could kind of like receive Rilke. I think receiving is the closest word I can find, because I found that I could read him so rapidly, and I felt like I had almost like an instinctive understanding of like every line. This rarely happens to me, but it was like an extremely intense experience for me. Yeah. So I think maybe on that note, I would kind of like end my presentation. But maybe just a few words about Rilke and like my experience of Rilke. I would say, having to describe that experience is not easy, but I would say it's, I think first of all, I found it amazing that I had this immediate connection with a German poet from like more than 100 years ago. But I could feel like the poems felt very present to me, that it was, and at the same time, I started to feel like a kind of expansion of myself, that things were possible. So this feeling is kind of like what I want to keep. And just kind of like in wrapping up the presentation, thank you for all your patience. I want to invite Tyler to read a poem by Rainer Maria Rilke. He will do it first in German, and then it will be followed by the words in English. So the poem is a 19008 poem called The Archaic Torso of Apollo. So, Tyler.
It's been 30 years since I've studied German. I know we have a couple of German speakers here. Sometimes life is just so unfair, but okay, it's Archaic Torso of Apollo. It was actually from a volume dedicated to Auguste Rodin's cross artistic process. Wir kannten nicht sein unerhörtes Haupt, darin die Augen nicht verreichten, aber sein Torso blüht noch wie ein Handlaber, in den sein Schauen nur zurückgeschaut, sich hebt und glänzt. Sonst könnte nicht der Blut der Brust dich blenden, und in leisen drehenden Lenden könnte nicht ein Riechen gehen zu jener Mitte, die die Zeugung trug. Sonst stünde dieser Stein entstellt und kurz unter der Schulter durchsichtigem Sturz und flimmerte nicht so wie Raubtierfälle und bräche nicht aus allen seinen Händen aus wie ein Stern. Denn da ist keine Stelle, die dich nicht sieht. Du musst dein Leben ändern. You cannot know his legendary head with eyes like ripened fruit, and yet his torso is still suffused with brilliance from inside like a lamp, in which his gaze, now turned to low, gleams in all its power. Otherwise, the curved breast would not dazzle you so, nor could a smile run through the placid hips and thighs to that dark center where procreation flared. Otherwise, the stone would seem defaced beneath the translucent cascade of the shoulders and would not glisten like a wild beast's fur, would not, from all the borders of itself, burst like a star. For here there is no place that does not see you. You must change your life. Well, we wanted to really preserve time for audience questions, so I think we might just skip to that. Well, I might just ask one question just to get things started, which is, what has it been like, sort of looking at your work through this special lens of the spiritual connection? And I just wonder if you could share your thoughts when we ask you about this, and then I noticed you had a way also of kind of obliquely addressing it through these images of the tiger or the time, maybe not quite head on.
Yeah, thank you. I must say, first of all, it's a challenge to think and to speak about spirituality in the state of our kind of like this discourse formation at the moment. You know, it's a challenge for me. But it was something I was interested in how I would deal with it. So I would say there are multiple ways that one can speak about spirituality. So for example, in the earlier part, the first part of my presentation was about a historical event, and through that we can look at how other cosmologies were disrupted through the process of colonization and a certain kind of homogenization that came with like enlightenment and the modern, and how other like cosmologies of other people were kind of like suppressed. Right? So we can kind of like look at that in an indirect way. But I think it becomes harder to speak about spirituality directly, like without going through the historical mode. So this was something that for me was one of the challenges of this presentation.
Well, thank you. Despite the challenge, I'm probably not the only one in the room that felt the resonance of the work and its explorations. So I think, yes, there is we've talked about this. There's a language generally for speaking about many things that happen in society, in the world, and especially in the context of how the art world then translates that and shares it with the public. The long history of that in the past 100 years. I think that the beauty of maybe modernity is that in some way it has saved us from what we call absolute truths. And that's so much of your work is about unpacking the non-truths and the multiplicity of truths and the transience of truth, and in that sense we forget, actually. I myself have forgotten many times in my life that in fact a great many spiritual traditions, the rituals that people engage in are part of their practice to deal with the uncertainty and the doubt. Often we believe that as soon as we talk about spirituality and religion, that there's some kind of like knowing immediately that it's eternal, and there's no there's no sort of like doubt and uncertainty. And in fact, there's so much of that there's a continuous expansion of the practice, and spirituality itself sort of has exploded in such ways. And in sort of in the spirit of like how you have engaged everything so openly. So like collaborating with everything, there is that many people would question, particularly technology, and you talked to us about, for instance, your next projects coming up, dealing with, you're going to begin to work with AI. I did just want to mention for those who have not, I just want to ask actually, how many people have seen Nyen's work, like in an exhibition? Just to take a tool. Okay. Okay. There's a lot of people that have seen the work, so that's great. Just because the also the challenge of this kind of a talk in presenting the multiplicity of layers of content that's presented, and incredible images and music, sound, the application of live actors, theater, opera singers. It is quite extensive in the way that even the animations are, let's say, animated. And so I did want to ask you about what do you feel is in this process, if you have discovered something about where your work is going and how can it be comfortably open in this relationship with spirituality, because it's really quite all there, and it has been beautifully also shared with us today.
Thank you. I think there's a couple of parts to the question. Maybe just about my attitudes with technology and using technology. So of course this is something that one is always questioning, and I like what you said about retaining doubts, but at the same time I think it's important not to be paralyzed or frozen by the doubts. So I think that what's key for me is like retaining the questions, but at the same time moving forward. So with a lot of the technologies that I'm using, I definitely start with a questioning kind of like perspective. But at the same time, I'm interested to see how these tools can be used for amplification of possibilities. And actually on the word like amplification, maybe I can move to like the second part of your question, which is like where I think like the work is going. So I would say my recent kind of like experience with Real Curve kind of like made me think about art in a completely like different way, because it was so immediate, and this like expansion of self was something new for me in feeling this immediacy. And I started thinking about that as a form of power. And once we think about power, today the word power is and it's a difficult word. Like when we think about power, we immediately imagine power as something exercised over someone else in a hierarchical kind of like system. I mean, this is the moment that we are living through. So power is always seen in the negative. But I feel like what I experienced, just like on the train amidst the crowd, was a kind of power in a positive sense, like something that expands. So I'm interested now to think about like these different understandings of power. So for example, just quickly, Spinoza has I think I started reading Spinoza because of these questions. So Spinoza says, I'm paraphrasing again, but he says something like, power is the capacity of a body to be affected. So the more you can be affected by different types of like intensities or sensations, the more power you have. And I find this a radical way of like reimagining power as something internal and as capacity. And in the Spinozian systems, because Spinoza was also a Republican, he says that in a perfect republic, we amplify each other's powers, which is kind of like totally opposite to how we imagine political structures today, which is always about curbing or restraining someone's power. So I would say that for me, it's kind of like the spark, possibly to the next project.
Well, we want to hear from everyone, so if people have thoughts or questions relating to these spiritual issues, we really welcome your comments.
I totally agree with you about the power scenario, but in the challenge you have about moving forward in the technical AI,
Get it closer, because we can't.
technical and AI world, where does the tiger fit in? Is the tiger still your timepiece? Is the tiger still your transformation? Is the tiger still going to be evolutionary in this or no? Because I feel like what you were just saying about moving forward, maybe he's kind of lost, but I'm not sure.
Thank you for the question. I would say perhaps the tiger returns in a form that I will not expect. And actually I'm curious about to see in what form or shape the tiger will return. And for a long time when I was working on the tiger projects, the tiger became for me a sign, in a way a sign of the eternal return. The tiger is that which eternally recurs. But recently I started getting troubled by the fact that like a lot of these returns were based on, I would say, like historical traumas, of like unresolved or unfinished business, which then calls forth its repetition in order to solve an earlier, or not to solve, but to work through an earlier historical trauma. But I'm starting to also wonder if, in a way, this return can be also freed of the past in this, I would say, in this repressive, negative sense. I don't know, So, but these are just kind of like my own ongoing questions.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. I really loved what you were talking about with the connection between animism and animation, because I also work with animation, and it's like I do find it a process that is a process that transforms you as you're going through it, and is also very, I don't know, very spiritually imbued for me, because yeah, as you're talking about, like it's like you, through that process you are kind of navigating your relationship to the physical realm and also the other stuff. So I was just wondering if you could talk about your relationship with it, is it just like a medium that you continuously work with, and how, and also like how do you think about it in relation to like a physical, like an installation setting?
Thank you for the question. Yeah, I feel like even though the first 10 years of my career when I was making videos, I was working with a video camera. But now in hindsight, actually, I think that all those works were all animation, even when I was working with a camera. Yeah, and I think this has something to do with my own specific understanding of mediums. So for me, because even when I was working with a camera, the systems in which I was using was already digital. And for me, the digital medium is something much closer to animation than the idea of the photography. You know, so the photography came out of like old like photographs or like films. There's a direct imprint of light on the negatives. So I suppose we call this an indexical print. Yeah, but in the digital format, the image is already transformed into like ones and zeros. So being able to work like physically on these like zeros and ones is for me a process that's like much closer to animation, because with animation you are always working directly with, in a sense, with the negative. So being able to control like pixels on the image, for me is like totally a kind of like animation process. So I would say in that sense, I would say animation is kind of like at the heart of like all my practices, because I think of the animation also as like they exist at some level as data. So being able to like shape, like give some kind of shape or form in how we manage like data, I would say that's one way I think about like how I work with images. And in a sense, it's also directly connected like with the installations that use other types of systems, for example, like smoke machines or light machines. Yeah. All of these are also controlled with a similar, with the same system, right? That is also like generating the images. So I guess that's kind of like how I look at my practice at this moment.
Thank you so much for your presentation. As you were speaking, I was thinking about May Adidol's work addressing this idea of animistic cinema, about projecting to please the spirits.
Yes.
And I was kind of imagining for a second your work as one that's pleasing those spirits, so to speak, and in what way can we see the tiger as that speaking, as that spirit. But it led me to that question about the relationship between technology and animism, and in what way this idea that we have an algorithm generate those images that you're producing, in what way does it change our relationship? Because obviously you're the one who's producing most of the algorithm, right? It's not completely hand-free. So I was just kind of curious about that complexity of the relationship to animism in that angle.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, so I think that's a wonderful topic to get into. So like for one or several tigers, there are two screens which are facing each other. So no human spectator can see both screens at the same time. So for me, the only type of beings that can see both sides at the same time must be non-human spiritual beings. So that's also kind of leads me to like imagining it as a kind of self-contained ritual. So that's in relation to the first part of your question. The next, like about algorithms, I think that's something which fascinates me a lot, because using algorithms to compose a work doesn't, in a sense, like abandon the work completely to chance, because it's still a composition. But it's just that instead of like composing for one single timeline to the exclusion of all others, you need to compose virtually for multiple timelines at the same time. And this is what I find like super fascinating. So you are creating not just one timeline, but multiple timelines. You are allowing like different worlds to coexist. But it's also not entirely random, because you need to give it some kind of shape. And each of these separate timelines start to have some kind of resonance with each other. So this is kind of like how I imagine the process. And I'm thinking of something I read about a Greek composer, Nyen. I was just reading a book where about how he sometimes writes scores for violinists, which are so difficult that no humans can play it. So at that moment when the violinist is looking at the score, the violinist needs to imagine how to solve this problem, how to get over the difficult part. Right? So in a way, it's a kind of composition, but at the same time, it allows for these kind of inflections and variations. So I've always been very inspired by that model, in like thinking about these algorithmic compositions, right? So it's not entirely just random. So there's a kind of sculpting of possibilities, but at the same time, it allows for differences and something from the outside to get into the work.
Hello, thank you so much for the presentation. And I have a specific question about One Earth Surfer Tiger and the role of the shadow puppet. Because I watched the video so many times and I'm like looking forward to see the shadow puppet at the end. And I'm wondering, like, also like the work itself is like a theatrical performance with the video and lights and shadow and the tigers and also the humans. And I'm wondering, like, can you tell us more about your decision of saving the shadow puppet to the end and why you included it as like the end of a work instead of a separate work?
Thank you for that. So we have a set of shadow puppets behind the work, and the shadow puppets are made out of buffalo skin, which is the traditional material of shadow puppetry. So just a little bit of like information about shadow puppetry. Like at the beginning of every shadow puppet show, usually you have these large like leaf-shaped fans. They function like curtains in the Western theatrical sense. And on these large leaf-shaped puppets, in the middle, there's always like a binary clash between two animals, and it's always the tiger and the buffalo. So in the Malay part of like Southeast Asia, this is kind of the classic like clash between like the buffalo, which is an animal of agriculture and civilization, and the tiger, which is like wild, uncontained nature. So I always wanted to like bring in this like element of and also this material of the buffalo skin like into the work itself. And another thing to note about like shadow puppetry is that shadow puppetry in shadow puppetry you have a light source which comes from behind the screen. Usually in projections, like this one over here, it's a front projection. So in the installation one or several tigers, I kind of imagine the screen to be double charged. Like on one side we have a projector projecting it from the front, but on the other side you have the indigenous Southeast Asian image making tradition, like projecting light from the back. So I imagine the screen to be supercharged with like both these like forms of projection. So I guess keeping it to the end, yeah, that's a really good question. Actually, nobody has like asked me that. So I would say there's because I began essentially with like film making. So I noticed that like the linear timeline, even if in some of my projects I try very hard to suspend it, but it's also the way I work and think. Yeah. So like keeping the shadow puppets to the end was a kind of a climactic and like revelation at the end. Right? So but when we place the work in a museum setting, I guess the end is also the beginning of the next loop. So even though it goes towards the end, I think the loop starts again and the circle continues. Yeah. So these are kind of like interesting shapes of time, that I like to imagine like happening, like that's kind of like what the work is doing in time, like creating and carving out these different types of shapes.
And we have one more question.
I have one more after that.
Thank you for the presentation. I was wondering if I could ask you to maybe talk a little bit more about what you said with the motion capture and animation. I think your presentation made it so interesting for me to think about how many video terms or animation terms, talking about animation, but also medium. How many of these linguistically are linked to that kind of liminal world, that space between life and death, and the divide between them. And I found it so interesting when you were talking about capturing a human and their body, and maybe you want to believe like their essence, and then digitizing that or virtualizing that, and where maybe you think the line of that person's life, where the edges of that living body kind of ends. I think it was also interesting in One or Many Tigers, you have a spectator can only see one screen at a time, and so in some ways the work isn't even made for like the perceiving human body, but like a larger virtual, digitized, like data-ized body or subject might perceive this on a larger scale. I mean, this is, for me, what's interesting about time is that we as a subject it's linear in our perception, but that maybe in a virtual realm, there's a database kind of perception where you can see all these modes of time and all these different parallel timelines at once, which is, yeah, like the liveliness or the animate nature of a digitized body, or how you perceive that.
Sure. Thank you. I think, I think first of all, it's interesting to think about our experience of linear time. Actually, one of the great mysteries of our universe is why we experience time in a linear sense. Actually, most laws of physics are symmetrical. Mm-hmm. So if you move something one direction, you can always reverse that. But time seems to be the only vector which is like irreversible. So, some scientists have, said that that's like related to entropy, like the second law of thermodynamics. Like when you have heat loss, that loss of heat is the arrow of time itself, or that, like maybe it's related to the Big Bang, and this radiation of the universe outwards creates this pool of time, which is linear. Yeah. But at the same time, sometimes I think like Freud, for example, he says the unconscious is timeless. He says that there's no time in the unconscious. We could argue with that, I think, but there's still an interesting idea there. So basically, if you think about what I mentioned earlier about trauma, like a trauma is an event that happened to you in the past which you cannot process. So it stays in your subconscious, in your present. So in a way, it becomes eternally present. So even though I think, even though we experience time as something linear, but that's like just one layer, I think there are all types of like other shapes of time that we are experiencing that we are not like possibly like entirely conscious of. So I suppose T for Time for me was in a way trying to give some kind of shape to this like multiplicity of like layers and levels. Mm-hmm. And the other part of your question, which is about the liminal, I think, definitely like, we speak about medium, the word medium. So here we think about medium as media. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But like if you were in Southeast Asia and you mentioned the word medium, that's not what we think about. We think about mediums in the sense of like channeling of like spirits. So it's kind of like interesting to always think about these two things like in relation to each other. And certain like great like books have been, anthropological studies have been done about this like confluence of these different types of medium. So mediumship. Yeah. So I think it's interesting this like, I think you use the word liminal. So that's certainly something that interests me. But I would say like a liminal zone is a zone in between. But sometimes I think like to be suspended in an in-between zone sometimes might not be necessarily the most like comfortable. So I like to think about liminality as the possibility to like move. So it's more interesting for me to have the possibility of like moving into one perspective or the other perspective, rather than to be like in no man's land, so to speak, like forever, but being able to enter and extract oneself. Yeah. So,
I think, yes, switching to linear time, I think but I wanted to thank you all for participating in this conversation, I think, about a really fascinating aspect of Sue's work, and also to thank Sue for really agreeing to share this part of his work and his personal practice with us today.
Well, I just want to thank everybody for coming and but mostly, and for the FSA for organizing and initiating this relationship, but was in the end.